in the morning light. Yeah. Would you mind if I said how I felt in the leave tonight? Again, 'cause I never, ever felt this way in my heart before.
The clock had just struck 12:30 a.m. when the first desperate call came through to the Spotsylvania County Sheriff's Office. The voice on the other end was frantic, breathless, reporting gunshots fired on Pondoli Drive in the Oak Grove subdivision of Virginia. Within seconds, another call flooded the emergency lines, this time from a neighbor who had been jolted awake by the unmistakable crack of gunfire piercing the September night. The dispatcher's fingers flew across the keyboard as she sent every available unit racing toward the 6100 block, their sirens cutting through the darkness like knives. When deputies arrived at the modest home, they found a scene that would haunt them for years to come. There, sprawled in the driveway under the pale glow of a porch light, lay 41-year-old Latoya Acree. Blood pooled beneath her body as she struggled for each breath, a gunshot wound to her upper torso stealing the life from her with every passing second. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their equipment bags hitting the asphalt as they dropped to their knees beside her. They worked with the desperate efficiency that comes from years of training, inserting IV lines, applying pressure, fighting against time itself. But even as they loaded her into the ambulance, even as they radioed ahead to the trauma center, they could see the light fading from her eyes. Latoya Acree, a woman whose powerful voice had moved audiences across the DC area, whose soulful melodies had the power to bring grown men to tears, would never sing again. But this wasn't just another random act of violence in suburban Virginia. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, or a case of mistaken identity, or even a stranger with a grudge. What detectives discovered in those first crucial hours would transform this from a straightforward homicide into something far more devastating. The 911 calls hadn't just come from concerned neighbors. One of those frantic voices on the phone had come from inside the house itself, from someone who had witnessed the shooting firsthand. Someone who knew exactly who had pulled that trigger. As investigators began their preliminary questioning, a horrifying truth emerged from the shadows of that family home. The person responsible for ending Latoya's life wasn't a stranger lurking in the darkness. It wasn't a random criminal who had chosen the wrong house on the wrong night. It was her own son. 21-year-old Elijah D. Smith had just committed the unthinkable. He had murdered his own mother, following what authorities would later classify as a domestic argument. The same woman who had given him life, who had raised him, who had stood by him through his troubles, now lay dying in their shared driveway because of his actions. But here's where this story takes an even more heartbreaking turn. Latoya Acree wasn't just any victim of domestic violence. She was a woman who had dedicated her platform, her voice, and her upcoming concert to raising awareness about the very issue that would ultimately claim her life. Her band, True Soul, had been preparing for a special performance, one specifically designed to shine a light on domestic abuse and help other victims find their way to safety. The woman who was meant to be a beacon of hope for other victims had become a victim herself. The advocate had been silenced by the very violence she was fighting against. And the person who stole her voice forever was the child she had brought into this world with love and hope for his future. Before we continue with this devastating story, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And more importantly, I want to know your thoughts. How do we, as a society, better recognize and address the warning signs that might prevent tragedies like this? Because Latoya's story isn't just about one family's nightmare. It's about a problem that affects millions of homes across our country. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like Latoya's need to be told. They need to be heard. and they need to inspire all of us to do better. To understand the magnitude of what was lost that September night, you need to know who Latoya Acree truly was. She wasn't just another name in a police report or another statistic in the growing numbers of domestic violence cases. Latoya was a force of nature, a woman whose voice could fill a room and whose presence could light up the darkest corners of any venue. At 41 years old, Latoya had found her rhythm in life. She was the powerhouse vocalist for True Soul, a band that had been making waves across the Washington, D.C. music scene for years. Their performances weren't just concerts. They were experiences that left audiences moved, transformed, and hungry for more. Latoya's voice was the kind that could make you feel every emotion she poured into a song, whether she was belting out a soul-stirring ballad or getting the crowd on their feet with an upbeat anthem. Caesar Roy, her bandmate and close friend, would later describe those final months of Latoya's life in terms that painted a picture of a woman whose star was rising. "Really, really happy," he said, reflecting on her mood and outlook. Things were just turning around for her. This wasn't the story of someone struggling or barely getting by. This was a woman who had found her place in the world and was watching her dreams come to life. The band had been gaining momentum, booking more gigs, attracting larger audiences, and building a reputation that extended far beyond the local club circuit. Latoya's voice was the heart of their sound, rich, powerful, and authentic in a way that you simply can't fake. When she sang, people listened. When she performed, rooms went silent except for the music flowing from her soul. But Latoya's ambitions reached beyond personal success and musical achievement. She understood the platform that her voice gave her, and she was determined to use it for something greater than entertainment. True Soul wasn't just another cover band playing weekend gigs for beer money. They were artists with a mission, performers with a purpose that went straight to the heart of one of society's most persistent problems. The band had been working tirelessly on something special, a concert specifically designed to raise awareness about domestic violence. This wasn't going to be just another show where they played their usual set list and collected their fee. This was going to be an event that mattered, a performance that could potentially save lives by educating their audience about an issue that affects millions of families across the country. Latoya threw herself into the preparation for this concert with the same passion she brought to every aspect of her music career. She researched statistics, connected with advocacy organizations, and worked to ensure that their message would be both powerful and accurate. The plan was to weave education seamlessly into their performance, using the universal language of music to reach people in ways that traditional awareness campaigns sometimes couldn't. Her commitment to this cause ran deeper than professional obligation or social responsibility. Latoya genuinely believed that her voice, the same voice that could move audiences to tears with a love song, could also move them to action when it came to protecting the vulnerable. She saw her platform as a gift that came with responsibility, and she was ready to use every note, every lyric, every moment on stage to make a difference. The timing of this concert project couldn't have been more significant in terms of Latoya's personal journey. Caesar Roy's observation that things were just turning around for her wasn't just about career success or financial stability. It was about a woman who had found her purpose, who understood her power, and who was ready to use both to create positive change in the world. She had reached that sweet spot that every artist dreams of, where talent meets opportunity, where passion aligns with purpose, and where the future seems bright with possibility. Her bandmates were excited about the direction they were heading. Their audiences were growing, their message was resonating. Everything was falling into place for a woman who had worked hard to get to this point in her life. Latoya's friends and fellow musicians described those final weeks as some of her happiest. She was energized by the upcoming awareness concert, excited about new songs the band was working on, and optimistic about the doors that seemed to be opening for them in the industry. She had that glow that comes when someone knows they're exactly where they're supposed to be, doing exactly what they're meant to do. The cruel irony of what would happen next, the fact that a woman preparing to use her voice to save others from domestic violence would herself become a victim of it, adds a layer of tragedy to this story that goes beyond the typical random act of violence. This wasn't just the loss of a talented performer or a beloved community member. This was the silencing of an advocate, the stealing of a voice that was meant to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. While paramedics fought desperately to save Latoya's life in those crucial first minutes, detectives were already working to piece together what had happened in that driveway. The initial evidence painted a troubling picture that would only grow darker as the investigation progressed. The first major break came from the witnesses themselves. Both the call from inside the house and the neighbor's report provided investigators with immediate context that ruled out any possibility of a random crime. This wasn't a break-in gone wrong, a carjacking, or any of the other scenarios that might typically explain a shooting in a residential area. The voices on those 911 calls told a different story entirely. Within the first hour of their investigation, detectives had zeroed in on their primary suspect, Elijah D. Smith, Latoya's 21-year-old son. The identification came swiftly, not through complex forensic analysis or lengthy witness interviews, but through the simple, devastating reality that family members had witnessed the shooting firsthand. But Elijah Smith wasn't just any young man. His background revealed troubling patterns that would add crucial context to the night's events. Just weeks before his mother's murder, Elijah had been released from jail on bond while awaiting trial for assault and battery charges. While these previous charges weren't related to domestic violence, they painted a portrait of someone with a documented history of aggressive behavior and violent tendencies. The assault case hanging over Elijah's head should have been a red flag, a clear indication that he was capable of using physical force to resolve conflicts. Yet somehow, he had been deemed suitable for release back into the community, back into the same household, where tensions were apparently already running high. The sequence of events that led to Latoya's death began with what investigators would later classify as a domestic argument between mother and son. The specific details of this confrontation remain largely private, but what's known is that it escalated far beyond the bounds of any normal family disagreement. 21 years old is an age when many young people are still finding their place in the world, still living at home, still navigating the complex relationship between independence and dependence on their parents. For some families, this transition period creates friction as boundaries are negotiated and expectations clash. But for the Acree family, these normal growing pains had apparently become something much more dangerous. The argument that night wasn't their first. Family dynamics that lead to murder rarely develop overnight. They typically involve months or years of building tension, escalating conflicts, and increasingly volatile interactions. While the public record doesn't detail the specific history between Latoya and Elijah, the fact that their disagreement turned deadly suggests a relationship that had been deteriorating for some time. What transformed this particular argument from words to violence remains one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this case. At some point during their confrontation, Elijah made the conscious decision to retrieve a firearm. He made the choice to point that weapon at his own mother, and he made the ultimate choice to pull the trigger, sending a bullet into her upper body that would end her life. The location of the shooting, the family's own driveway, adds another layer of tragedy to the event. This wasn't a crime that happened in some dark alley or dangerous neighborhood. This was violence that erupted in the most intimate of settings, in the place where Latoya should have felt safest, perpetrated by the person who should have protected her above all others. After firing the fatal shot, Elijah fled the scene, leaving his mother bleeding in the driveway while family members and neighbors called for help. His escape was short-lived and ultimately pointless. When you commit a domestic homicide, there's really nowhere to run. That law enforcement won't eventually find you. The manhunt for Elijah Smith lasted only hours. Investigators tracked him to a motel in nearby 4 Mile Fork, where he was taken into custody without incident. The fact that he didn't resist arrest suggests that on some level, he understood the gravity of what he had done and the futility of trying to evade justice. The swift apprehension meant that there was no prolonged period of community fear, no manhunt that kept neighbors looking over their shoulders. But it also meant that the shocking reality of what had happened, a son murdering his mother, hit the community with full force almost immediately. For investigators, having their suspect in custody so quickly should have been a relief. It meant they could begin building their case without the pressure of an ongoing search. But it also meant confronting the brutal reality of a family destroyed from within. A young man whose life was essentially over, and a talented woman whose voice had been permanently silenced by someone she had loved unconditionally. The preliminary investigation confirmed what everyone already suspected but hoped wasn't true. This was indeed a case of domestic homicide, with all the particular heartbreak that such crimes carry. The argument that preceded the shooting, while not detailed in public records, had clearly escalated beyond anything that could be resolved with words. What makes this case particularly significant is how it illuminates the complex nature of domestic violence within families. We often think of domestic abuse in terms of romantic partnerships, but the reality is that family violence can take many forms and involve many different relationships. Parents and adult children, siblings, extended family members, all of these relationships have the potential to become toxic and, in extreme cases, deadly. As we continue to explore this tragic story, I want to pause and engage with you, our viewers. How do we as a community better recognize when family conflicts are escalating beyond normal disagreements? What resources should be available for families struggling with these kinds of tensions? Share this video to help spread awareness about all forms of domestic violence, not just those involving romantic partners. And let me know in the comments, what do you think could have been done differently to prevent this tragedy? While Elijah D. Smith sat in his jail cell at Rappahannock Regional Jail, the legal machinery that would determine his fate began its slow, methodical process. But for families like the Acrees, the path from arrest to resolution is rarely straightforward, and the pursuit of justice often becomes a marathon rather than a sprint. The case that prosecutors would build against Elijah was both straightforward and heartbreaking. Unlike many murder cases where investigators spend months trying to establish motive, means, and opportunity, this domestic homicide had witnesses, a clear timeline, and a suspect who had been apprehended within hours. The evidence was overwhelming, the circumstances undeniable. But having a strong case doesn't always translate to a quick resolution. Court calendars are crowded, defense attorneys need time to prepare, and the wheels of justice grind slowly even in the most obvious cases. For months, Elijah remained behind bars, while legal teams on both sides prepared their strategies. The prosecution faced the challenge of presenting a case that was both legally sound and emotionally devastating. How do you explain to a jury the mindset that leads a 21-year-old man to shoot his own mother? How do you make sense of a domestic argument that escalated to murder? These aren't just legal questions. They're human questions that touch on some of our deepest fears about family, violence, and the breakdown of the most fundamental bonds. During this period, the absence of Latoya's voice became increasingly apparent to those who had known and loved her. Court proceedings moved forward without her input, without her perspective, without her ability to speak for herself about the relationship with her son that had ended so tragically. In domestic violence cases, the victim's silence is often the most devastating aspect of the legal process. The defense, meanwhile, would likely explore Elijah's mental state, his background, and any factors that might explain, though never excuse, his actions. At 21, he was young enough that questions about his development, his judgment, and his capacity for rehabilitation would inevitably arise. But those questions would have to be balanced against the undeniable fact that he had deliberately ended his mother's life. Throughout these legal proceedings, one element that would repeatedly surface was the tragic irony of Latoya's advocacy work. Here was a woman who had dedicated herself to raising awareness about domestic violence, only to become a victim of it within her own family. This wasn't just another case study in the statistics she had been researching. This was her life, ended by the very type of violence she was trying to prevent. The court proceedings also revealed more details about the family dynamics that had led to that fatal September night. While much of this information would remain sealed to protect family privacy, What emerged painted a picture of escalating tensions that had been building long before the final confrontation. As the case moved through the legal system, the impact on Latoya's extended family and friends became increasingly apparent. Caesar Roy and the other members of True Soul found themselves grappling not just with grief, but with the complex emotions that come when someone you care about is killed by someone else you're supposed to care about. How do you mourn a friend while simultaneously trying to process the actions of her son? The legal resolution, when it finally came, brought a measure of closure, but little comfort. In cases like these, even the harshest sentence feels inadequate when measured against the loss of a life and the destruction of a family. Justice, in the legal sense, may have been served, but justice in the cosmic sense, the kind that might restore balance or meaning to such a senseless tragedy, remained elusive. What the legal proceedings ultimately confirmed was something that everyone already knew, but perhaps hadn't fully accepted. Elijah D. Smith had indeed murdered his mother following a domestic dispute, and now he would face the consequences of that choice for the rest of his life. The boy who had once been Latoya's pride and joy was now her killer, and no amount of legal accountability could change that devastating reality. In the weeks following Latoya's murder, her bandmates in True Soul faced an impossible decision. The domestic violence awareness concert they had been planning, the very event that Latoya had poured her heart into, was still scheduled to take place. But how do you proceed with an advocacy concert when your lead vocalist has just become a victim of the exact violence you were planning to address? Caesar Roy and the rest of the band could have easily canceled the show. No one would have blamed them for stepping back, for taking time to grieve privately, for avoiding the painful irony of performing a concert about domestic violence so soon after losing their friend to it. Instead, they made a decision that would honor Latoya's memory in the most powerful way possible. True Soul transformed their planned awareness concert into something far more personal and profound. A memorial celebration of Latoya's life and a continuation of the mission she had started. The concert would go on, but now it carried the weight of her story, the power of her actual experience, and the urgency that comes only from real loss. The performance became something unprecedented in the domestic violence advocacy space. Here was a band that didn't just have statistics to share or generic stories to tell. They had lived through the devastating reality of losing someone they loved to family violence. Their message carried an authenticity and emotional weight that no prepared speech or educational pamphlet could match. When Caesar Roy took the stage and spoke about his bandmate, about seeing her just hours before her death, about her excitement for this very concert, the audience wasn't just hearing about domestic violence as an abstract social issue. They were confronting it as a personal, immediate, devastating reality that had stolen someone with a name, a face, a voice, and dreams for the future. The concert served a dual purpose that Latoya herself might never have imagined. It honored her memory while simultaneously amplifying her message in ways that her original plan never could have achieved. Her death had transformed her from an advocate speaking about a problem to a symbol of that problem's most heartbreaking consequences. But the impact of Latoya's story extends far beyond that single memorial concert. Her case has become a powerful reminder that domestic violence doesn't discriminate based on awareness, education, or good intentions. It can strike anyone, anywhere, even those who are actively working to combat it. The tragic irony of her death, a domestic violence advocate killed by domestic violence, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of family violence. It challenges the assumption that awareness alone is protection. It demonstrates that knowledge about the problem doesn't necessarily translate to immunity from it. Her story also highlights the often overlooked reality of violence between family members who aren't romantic partners. While much of our domestic violence discourse focuses on intimate partner abuse, Latoya's case reminds us that family violence can involve parents and children, siblings, extended relatives, and other household members. The dynamics are different, but the devastation is just as real. The fact that Elijah had a history of violent behavior, even if not specifically domestic in nature, raises important questions about how our systems identify and respond to individuals who pose potential threats to their family members. His recent release on bond for assault charges, followed by his mother's murder just weeks later, suggests gaps in our ability to predict and prevent escalation. For advocates working in the domestic violence field, Latoya's death serves as both inspiration and cautionary tale. Her commitment to using her platform for awareness work demonstrates the power of personal advocacy, while her tragic end reminds us that the fight against domestic violence requires systemic changes, not just individual efforts. The members of True Soul have continued to honor Latoya's memory through their music and their ongoing advocacy work. They understand that her voice may have been silenced, but her message lives on through their performances, through the conversations her story generates, and through the lives that might be saved by increased awareness. Every time they take the stage now, they carry not just their own talents, but the memory of their friend who believed so deeply in music's power to create change. Every domestic violence awareness event they participate in carries the additional weight of honoring someone who died, trying to make the world safer for others. Latoya's legacy isn't just about the tragedy of her death. It's about the continuation of her mission by those who loved her. It's about transforming grief into action, loss into purpose, and silence into an even more powerful voice for change. Her story continues to resonate because it embodies the complexity and heartbreak of domestic violence in all its forms. She was simultaneously an advocate and a victim, a voice for change and a casualty of the very problem she was fighting. This duality makes her story both more tragic and more powerful than either element would be alone. If Latoya's story has moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Truly Criminal Network for more stories that need to be told. Share this video with others because awareness really can save lives. And if you or someone you know needs help with domestic violence, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233. Latoya's voice may have been silenced, but her fight continues through all of us.